Dams and the hydroelectric power stations that come with them provide one of the most crucial resources, electricity. It's needed today, and it was needed back in the last century when the industry was only starting to take on a more or less modern form. Yes, there's a downside. Dams block the river's flow, flooding land that could be used for agriculture, housing, manufacturing, and more. But when the construction of a dam is approached with the sole aim of generating energy, and there's a complete disregard for the huge amount of preliminary research work required, a disaster happens. We're talking about the Vajont Dam. It's in northern Italy, right here. The Vajont Dam was first planned back in the 1920s, but then came global instability. World War II, with Italy directly involved, the country's downfall. In the end, the Italians only got around to building it in 1956, when the nation had more or less recovered from its wartime defeat. People from the agricultural south started flocking to the north, where factories were popping up and city populations were growing. So there was a need for a lot of electricity. And luckily, the Alps were nearby, offering plenty of hydropower potential. Plus, it was easier to tap into compared to other places since mountain rivers are simpler to block. A dam could take up way less space than if it were built on a different terrain. However, because of this, the dam had to be taller. And when it comes to height, the Vajont Dam outdid many similar structures of its time. It stretched up into the sky at 860 feet. That's, for example, 138 feet taller than the famous Hoover Dam. If that doesn't impress you, here's an interesting fact. If you check the rankings of the world's tallest dams right now, you'll see that as of 2024, Vajont holds 10th place. In other words, the achievement of Italian engineers is still rarely surpassed. Moreover, there's another fact that highlights their brilliance. None of their competitors were built before this Alpine dam. Like all such structures, the dam created a reservoir with a capacity of nearly 35 billion gallons. Together with the dam, the reservoir was meant to be the heart of a complex water management system where water would be directed from nearby valleys and artificial basins at higher elevations. The plan was to add dozens of miles of concrete pipes and pipe bridges spanning the valleys. Plans are good, but right after construction began, it became clear that the location wasn't exactly ideal. At first, the residents of the nearby communities of Erdo and Casso were totally against it, so they took to the streets to protest the construction. They argued that more research should be done before building such a facility near Mount Toc. Both communities were right next to the planned construction site and definitely knew, without any complicated studies, what to expect in this area. Here's where they plan to build the dam. Here's Erdo, and right over here, directly across from Mount Toc, is Casso. So what can you expect? Well, in Friulian, Toc is short for Patok, which means rotten or soggy. On top of that, the locals used to call Toc the mountain that walks. All these weird and creepy names came about because many people believed that Mount Toc was prone to landslides. Same goes for all the surrounding mountains. For instance, some say that a long time ago, a chunk of the mountain broke off right here and crashed into the valley, shaping the way it looks today. Besides, on March 22, 1959, it turned out that this region, in general, had a lot of landslides. About 7 miles from the under-construction Vajont Dam, a chunk of mountain broke off into the reservoir of a similar dam, Pontisai, creating a 66-foot wave. Yes, landslides in such areas can create real tsunamis because the water needs somewhere to go when a huge chunk of mountain falls into it. Without any earthquakes or other tectonic activity, depending on the lake and the piece that fell into it, a real disaster can happen. For example, in the case of the landslide at Pontisai, one person died. You could say they were lucky because there were no big settlements nearby. Actually, shifts in the Earth's crust can also play a direct role here because it's precisely because of them that landslides can occur in certain situations. And it just so happens that in this area of the Italian Alps, working with seismographs is really not that uncommon. But SAID, the company that was building the Vajont Dam, didn't pay any attention to this. They insisted that the geological studies had been done and Mount Toc was stable enough for the project. Moreover, they had analyzed previous landslides which supposedly confirmed the region's safety. But already during construction, things started to go wrong. In 1959, when workers were building a new road on the slope of Mount Toc, troubling signs appeared, shifts and cracks in the ground. This raised concerns, and independent experts warned the company that the whole slope of the mountain was unstable. They said that filling the reservoir would inevitably increase the risk of a landslide. But the management of SAID ignored these warnings. Construction continued, and by October 1959, the dam was completed. In early 1960, the company got approval to start filling the reservoir. Almost immediately, there were signs of trouble that the project could turn into a disaster. On the slopes of Mount Tok, local people and experts observed regular landslides. This caused public unrest, especially after the local newspaper published an article about the high likelihood of a catastrophe. Instead of addressing the issue, the authorities filed lawsuits against the publication for spreading fake news. Still, the locals remained skeptical about the safety of the area. Their fears were confirmed in November 1960 when the first major landslide occurred. About 27 million cubic feet of soil collapsed into the reservoir, causing a 6-foot wave. Fortunately, there were no casualties. After that, the water level in the reservoir was lowered, and engineers conducted further studies, installing piezometers and drilling exploratory wells to monitor the soil condition. In an attempt to secure the system, a bypass tunnel was built in October 1961 that could connect the upper and lower sections of the reservoir in case of a separation due to a landslide. However, all the engineers' efforts proved to be insufficient. Over the next few years, the water level in the reservoir went up and down several times, but each time the rise in water level caused the soil on the slopes of Mount Tok to creep. In November 1962, due to heavy rainfall, the water level reached 778 feet. The soil movement speed increased to 0.4 inches per day. Draining the reservoir temporarily stabilized the situation, but in the spring of 1963, the problem returned. In April, the water level rose again, and the speed of the soil movement reached about 0.2 inches per day. It was clear that the water had a direct impact on the slope stability. One could say the mountain was being washed out. In the summer of 1963, the situation became critical. Precipitation similar to last year's led to the water level reaching a record 814 feet, just 49 feet below the dam crest. Ground movement increased to more than 1.2 inches per day. By early October, the situation had become so dangerous that the speed of movement reached almost 8 inches per day. The mountain literally started sliding down in chunks. In the local settlements, they realized the danger was close. The mayor of Urdo issued an official order for a partial evacuation of residents. In neighboring Kaso, people were ordered to evacuate from the slopes, warning about an expected wave. However, these measures weren't enough. Despite the efforts of the local authorities and expert warnings, things were quickly spiraling out of control. Mount Tok was about to show everyone who truly ruled these lands. October 9, 1963 became one of the most tragic nights in Italy's history. The calm, dark sky suddenly split with the roar and hiss of a massive amount of earth and rocks that broke loose from the mountain and crashed into the Vaillant Reservoir. In just 45 seconds, millions of tons of soil and rock, moving like an avalanche, rushed downward. It was the most catastrophic landslide in Europe's history. 9.4 billion cubic feet of soil, rocks, and everything else on the mountain crashed into the reservoir. For comparison, this volume was twice the amount of water held by the dam itself. Imagine a mass 1.2 miles wide and 0.9 miles deep falling all at once. If you look from above, this is how much the mountain shed at that moment. And this is what the place looks like now. The chunk that fell off was just massive. The landslide triggered powerful seismic tremors, which were even recorded in Vienna and Brussels, hundreds of miles away from the disaster's epicenter. But there were even more terrifying consequences. When the chunk of the mountain fell into the lake, it displaced a massive amount of water. It flew out of the reservoir. The rock strike created 3 waves. One went upwards towards Kaso before falling back onto the landslide. The second one moved deeper into the mountains and ended up destroying some towns. But the third wave became the biggest nightmare. Just a reminder, a huge amount of water was pushed out of the reservoir, so the waves were enormous. The third one especially was noteworthy as it went toward the dam that stands over 820 feet tall. This wave carried 13 billion gallons of water. Imagine this chaos, an explosive torrent of water, rocks, and air surging upwards with wild force to a massive height. The wave literally wiped out everything in its path, rushing down the valley of the Vaillant River. Flooding hit everything within a few miles. A massive wall of water created a flood depth at the river mouth of about 230 feet. This natural disaster took thousands of people by surprise as it all happened at night, while everyone was sleeping in their homes, unaware that within minutes their lives would be shattered forever. Millions of tons of water that burst out reached the valley behind the dam, picked up a bunch of debris, turned into a deadly flow, and then moved into the southern sector of the town of Longarone. In just a few minutes, the sleeping town was almost completely destroyed, with only the town hall left standing. Out of around 1,328 residents at risk, 1,269 people died. Though it was nearly impossible to determine the exact number, one thing was certain: surviving such a catastrophe was almost impossible, both for the buildings of that time and for people of any time. Signals about a potential threat started coming in from all corners of the province. The firefighters immediately headed to the scene, but soon encountered an insurmountable obstacle. The road leading out of the valley was completely washed away. But the situation in Longeron was even more terrifying. The firefighters from Pieve de Cadore were the ones who made it there. They were the first to realize the full scale of the disaster and reported it to command. On the morning of October 10th, the first soldiers of the Italian army arrived at the scene of the tragedy. They were mostly Alpine troops, many of whom belonged to sapper units. They dug into the ground by hand to find the bodies of the missing. The rescue operation was picking up speed. Firefighters from 46 provincial teams joined in. In total, 850 people were working at the scene. These were divers, ground and helicopter crews, and technical support specialists. The work was extremely dangerous. In the murky water and among the mud, divers searched for the bodies of the dead and barrels of toxic substances. When the water receded, the final cleanup of the mud began. Hundreds of buildings were either completely destroyed or buried under tons of rubble and dirt. Fields and roads disappeared, and all that was left in the area were just ruins. The towns of Casso and Urdo were also destroyed, though not as severely as Longeron. 158 people died there. During the dam collapse, extensive monitoring was carried out. There were 20 technical specialists in the control center on the left abutment. They all perished. The tragedy struck instantly, and none of them had time to escape. Equally terrible events unfolded near the right dam abutment. Office and hotel buildings standing almost 330 feet above the reservoir were totally wiped out by the wave. 40 people lost their lives there. Downstream, apart from Longeron, there were a few other settlements, Villanova and Fay. They too were damaged to some extent by the floodwaters that breached the dam. The official death toll is 1,917 people, but there are suggestions that as many as 2,500 people living near the Vaillant Dam may have died. Yes, it's a terrible tragedy, but the most interesting thing is that the dam itself, the very reason for these awful events, was almost untouched. Only the top 3-foot layer of stonework was washed away. The main structure remained unharmed. The designers really thought through the dam structure, but they didn't take the valley's basin geology into account, and that's what became the fatal mistake. The landslide was triggered by the principle of slope instability. The water level of the Vaillant Reservoir kept rising because of heavy rainfall, which caused the soil to become saturated, lowering its strength and basically pushing the rock to collapse. The mass of rocks moved as a single block, sliding along the saturated layers of clay that acted like natural lubricant, reducing friction along the failure plane. These same layers also worked like a membrane, holding the water in. It turned out that slope stability tests weren't done either during the dam's construction or when it was first filled. Even when a major instability showed up in November 1960, the necessary studies still weren't carried out. The disaster became a tragic reminder of the importance of geotechnical studies in dam design. From the start, the authorities pinned the tragedy solely on natural causes, claiming it was an unforeseen and unavoidable event. The newspapers were filled with official statements trying to sweep the mistakes under the rug, but one newspaper openly challenged this version, publishing warnings about a potential disaster that had been ignored. The publications triggered a backlash from leading media outlets. Their authors were accused of exploiting the tragedy for political gain. In government circles, there were even claims that the aid to the victims was being used to advance political interests. Despite all the efforts of the honest newspapers, official promises to bring justice for the victims quickly turned into cynicism. A former high-ranking official started defending the interests of the company responsible for the project and managed to significantly reduce compensation for the survivors. Meanwhile, some media outlets made shocking statements about the tragedy being a divine plan, which sparked a wave of outrage. People will do anything to avoid taking responsibility. What's the outcome of all this? The trial was moved far from the site of the tragedy, which kept the locals from taking part in the process. The responsible parties got lenient sentences, and the government still hasn't filed a lawsuit for damages. What happened after this catastrophe, which became a lesson for all of world dam construction? Most of the survivors had to leave their native mountains and move to the newly built village of Vaillant, located 31 miles southeast on the plain of the Tagliamento River. Life there took on a new shape. Straight streets, modern houses, and farms. Longeron and other villages in the Piave Valley were also rebuilt. this time with modern standards in mind. Sturdy houses and infrastructure that can handle the new challenges of nature. In the meantime, the Vaillant Dam still towered over the valley. To maintain a safe water level, a pumping station was set up, and the bypass gallery was extended so that the water could flow into the Piave Valley. However, the plans to use the dam for power generation were never resumed. One day, years after the disaster, the reservoir, long dried up and filled with a landslide, was open to visitors. Since 2002, it's become a pilgrimage site for those wanting to see the place where nature and human ambition clash with catastrophic consequences. Visitors can take a walk along the footpath at the top of the dam and other interesting spots. In September 2006, an annual non-competitive event called Paths of Remembrance was launched, allowing runners to connect with history. On February 12, 2008, UNESCO, while launching the International Year of Planet Earth, called the tragedy at the Vaillant Dam one of the 5 cautionary tales caused by the failure of engineers and geologists. And the most important thing is that no one even thinks about using the dam again to get precious energy where it shouldn't be done. It's a shame that it took total destruction and thousands of victims to realize this.